So, just back to the cardiac cycle, look at a few video clips in Google or somewhere else, type in cardiac cycle and have a look at different video clips, get different perspectives on it and choose the one that seems easiest to you to understand. It's quite important, this, as you can imagine, this cardiac cycle. So, cardiac output, the amount of blood that comes out of the heart per beat, per minute, is not always the same. It's different, for example, when we fall asleep compared to when we're running around, it's different in the resting situation, parasympathetic side, compared to fear, fight and flight, sympathetic side. It's different between acetylcholine and noradrenaline, as you'll see in the practical on the 27th. So here are a few points. The heart rate, of course, is the number of times the heart beats per minute, not per second, not per minute, beats per minute. And let's assume that the average adult resting heart rate is around about 75 beats per minute. So if we measured everybody's heart rate in here right now, some people will be 60, some people 70, some people 80, roughly 70 beats per minute. The stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected from the heart each beat. The stroke volume, the stroke, if you like, the contraction, and the amount of blood that comes out of the heart with each beat. And so we can calculate the cardiac output in mils per minute or litres per minute. Get the units right, don't mix and match, so it's mils per minute or litres per minute. And if we assume, for example, 75 beats per minute is the heart rate, and we assume the stroke volume is 70 mils per beat, you multiply one by the other, and you get, in this case, 5250 mils per minute. Or, divide by 1,000, you get 5.25 litres per minute. Okay, so that's the normal resting cardiac output, around about 5 litres per minute. So things that can affect the heart rate and things that can affect stroke volume, or both, and here are some things that can do that. We'll talk about some of these. So if we look at the heart rate here on the left, things that can affect that include autonomic innervation, in other words, parasympathetic, sympathetic innervation, that can affect heart rate. Probably right now you know that sympathetic stimulation will increase heart rate, and parasympathetic would reduce heart rate. Yeah? When we sleep, parasympathetic rate goes down. When we run, sympathetic rate goes up. Hormones. Various hormones can affect heart rate. Adrenaline, epinephrine, that's the hormone equivalent to noradrenaline or norepinephrine, the transmitter. It's a sympathetic hormone. And thyroxine, for example, you may have heard of thyroxine. And various other hormones can affect heart rate. Fitness levels can affect heart rate. So, for example, if somebody's doing a regular cardio workout in the gym, you would expect their resting heart rate to be lower than somebody who's unfit. You'd also expect the maximal heart rate to be affected by exercise. Age, over time, the heart rate starts to fall, so it's highest in very young, and then it starts to gradually get less and less with age. So these are things that can affect heart rate. And if we look at things that can affect stroke volume, heart size, again, our cardio workout person, they will develop physiological hypertrophy. Their heart will become bigger. The thickness of the ventricles will become bigger. If you like, the heart will become stronger. And that, of course, will affect stroke volume, won't it? Fitness levels, again, male-female differences. Contractility, we'll talk about that in a few moments. Duration of contraction. We'll talk about preload. Preload is the amount of blood that fills the heart. In other words, that's responsible for the end diastolic volume. Where does it come from? It comes from the venous return, doesn't it? Superior, inferior vena cava, feeding blood to the right side of the heart. the more blood that's fed to the right side of the heart, the more will be the preload, and the more will be the end diastolic volume. Afterload, very briefly, is the load or the resistance to blood coming out of the heart. So, for example, it's normally, our blood pressure is normally about 120/70, something like that. But if you have somebody with hypertension, where the blood pressure is much higher, so look at the pressure in the aorta, for example, if it's much higher, it means the heart will have to work harder, won't it, to pump blood into that high pressure circuit. That's the idea of afterload, it's after the heart. So if the pressure is higher, the heart will have to work harder, won't it, to push it into the circulation, into the systemic circulation. So preload and afterload and all these other things are affecting stroke volume. And as you can see here, the cardiac output is the heart rate times the stroke volume. So if you want to define stroke volume, you can say it's the difference between the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood that collects in the ventricle during diastole or filling, and end systolic volume, the volume of blood remaining in the ventricle after it's contracted. Okay? So filling, emptying, the difference between when it's filled and when it's empty is the stroke volume. So end diastolic volume, normally about 120 mils, is determined by the length of ventricular diastole and the venous pressure. So you can allow more time for the ventricle to fill. Yeah? The venous return can be greater. These things will change the fill of the ventricles, won't they? Yeah? End systolic volume, let's say normally 50 mils, it's not exactly 50, but let's say around 50, it's determined by arterial pressure. So for example, as I mentioned, if you've got somebody with hypertension, the pressure would go up, wouldn't it? So the end systolic volume, normally about 50 mils, is determined by arterial blood pressure. The higher the pressure, the higher the end systolic volume and the force of ventricular contraction. So in other words, the amount of blood that's left in the ventricle depends on the force of contraction and also the afterload pressure, the pressure in front of the heart, if you like, trying to restrict the movement of blood from the ventricle into the systemic circulation. If the blood pressure gets more and more and more, so if somebody with hypertension, if the pressure goes on increasing, the heart will have to work harder and harder, won't it? So the heart will actually undergo pathophysiological hypertrophy. Yeah? This isn't cardio workout hypertrophy. This is in response to a pathological problem or a pathophysiological problem of hypertension. Yeah? Here's a little example. So one other number or figure that we need to be aware of is ejection fraction. Ejection, obviously that's blood coming out of the heart, and the fraction of it. And so the ejection fraction is a measurement of the percentage of blood leaving your heart each time it contracts. So in other words, if you had 100 mils of blood and 50 mils came out, the ejection fraction would be 50%, wouldn't it? Yeah? So, an example. Here we've got a 70 kilogram person. The stroke volume is approximately 70 mils. And the left ventricular end diastolic volume is 120, giving an ejection fraction of 70 divided by 120 multiplied by 100, 0.58 or 58%. Yeah? Ejection fraction. So healthy individuals typically have ejection fractions of between 50 and 65%. If the ejection fraction increases, 65, 75, 80%, it means there's going to be less blood left, isn't it? You're eating into that cardiac reserve, if you like, what's left. And systolic volume is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the ejection fraction gets bigger and bigger. So, systolic and diastolic pressure, again terms. Systolic pressure, when the heart beats, it squeezes and pushes blood through the arteries to the rest of the body. This force creates a pressure on the blood vessels, and this is the systolic blood pressure. Diastolic pressure in the arteries when the heart rests between beats. This is the time when the heart fills with blood and picks up oxygen, the diastolic. And the blood pressure less than around 120/80, 120 systolic, 80 diastolic is considered normal. So if you've got a blood pressure of 140/80 or 120/100 or something like that, that means either the systolic or the diastolic pressure is higher than normal. Okay? Okay, sorry. So how is the volume and heart rate regulated? So there are three things I wanted to talk about: something preload, afterload, and inotropy, or contractility. Inotropy. Another word for that is contractility. So if we just focus initially on stroke volume rather than heart rate, here we can see various things that can affect end diastolic volume and various things that can affect end systolic volume. So end diastolic volume, the amount of blood in the heart, the filling, can be affected by preload, can be affected by afterload, or can be affected by contractility. Yeah? So if you increase preload, if you increase the venous return to the heart is going to fill more, isn't it? It's going to fill more. And what happens is that the heart automatically responds by contracting more forcefully. And so the stroke volume increases. Afterload, imagine now after the heart the pressure increases more and more. The stroke volume will get less, won't it? Because the heart's having to work harder to move blood from the ventricles into that high pressure environment. So if the pressure builds up more and more and more and more, actually, the heart may not be able to cope with that increased pressure. And if we get an increase in contractility or inotropy, something that will increase the force of contraction of the heart, that will obviously increase the stroke volume, won't it? If you increase the stroke volume of blood coming out, it means there's going to be less blood left. So that's why there's a decrease in end systolic volume. In other words, the more the heart contracts, the more blood will come out of the heart, and the less blood will be left. Yeah? So that's why stroke volume increases are associated with reductions in end systolic volume. Okay, so preload. I've talked a little bit about preload, but this is important, this sentence here. The heart has intrinsic, automatic, if you like, ability to adjust its output in response to changes in venous return. It's called Frank-Starling law of the heart. So what's that saying is the more blood you put into the heart, the more the heart will contract to try and move it forward. And it's automatic, this. You can do experiments that shows this. And here is an experiment. And this, on this axis here, we've got ventricular end diastolic volume, how much blood is in the ventricle at the end of the filling stage. And here we've got the stroke volume, if you like, the contraction of the heart. And what you can see from this diagram here is as you increase the filling, as the heart blows up like a balloon, if you like, you get an increase in the contraction of the stroke volume. And that's shown in this red line here. It doesn't go on forever, obviously, but you can see that there's a relationship between end diastolic volume and stroke volume. It's the Frank-Starling law that talks about this. And if you look for a mechanism, this here is the interaction of the actinomycin in main. So this is a sarcomere, if you like, Z line, and the interaction. So down here, when the volume in the ventricle is quite low, you can imagine that these are overlapping. These actinomycin and crossbreeds overlapping quite a lot. But as the ventricle starts to fill, you can imagine that these can be stretched apart. Yeah? The actinomycin relationship is stretched apart. And that's what's going on here. Can you see these here? Yeah, so you can see here, the difference between this and this is that the whole thing is being stretched apart, isn't it? And you might imagine that as you stretch it apart, the relationship between the actin and myosin reaches an optimal, where you get maximal contraction. But if you stretch it too much, some of the cross bridges may no longer form. Some of the actin and myosin relationships, you may lose that. So that's what's going on up here. It's like there's no interaction anymore. Can you see that? So one explanation for this Frank-Starling relationship is to do with the interaction of actin and myosin in the cross-bridge cycling. Another explanation for this is you know that in ventricular myocytes there are calcium channels. Now imagine if those calcium channels were stretch sensitive. So you've got a calcium channel, and if you stretch the membrane, the calcium channel may open a bit more and allow more calcium in. Once again, you can do experiments that shows that if you increase ventricular end diastolic volume, you increase stroke volume, and if you're also measuring calcium at the same time, you could show that calcium was going up inside the cell. So that's another explanation. One explanation is to do with the arrangement of the actin and myosin, and the other is to do with maybe calcium, stretch-activated calcium channels. We know that calcium is important in contraction, don't we? So clearly, if you stretch the cell and allow more calcium in, you're going to get a bigger force of contraction. So that's another explanation. So this is preload. Preload. How much blood gathers in the heart, for example, from the superior and inferior venous cava, venous return, if you like. And the more blood that gathers in the heart, the more the heart will stretch, and the more the heart will contract. So it's like the heart is trying to move all the blood on that it receives. Yeah. So it's an automatic, intrinsic mechanism. So if we look at this little graph here, we can see that the heart rate normally beating at 75. Okay. Let's say stroke volume is 70 normally. Multiply the two, and you get a cardiac output of 5,250. What's different is if you increase the stroke volume, now you're multiplying 75 by a bigger figure, so you get a bigger cardiac output. So this is actually what's happening when you increase the venous return, isn't it? You increase the venous return, the ventricle stretches, and the stroke volume increases. What's happening in this middle bar here. So cardiac muscle fibers are stretched by increased blood volume, returning to the heart, or increased venous return, and then diastolic volume. Increased stretch of the heart results in greater force of contraction, which increases stroke volume. Yeah? So this is preload. Preload, remember preload, remember Frank-Starling. Remember, as you increase end diastolic volume, you increase the stroke volume, or the force of contraction. Automatic. The next thing